Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Yeah, that was pretty good. Excellent. Welcome to our Women in Leadership Roles panel discussion at Rowan College of Burlington County. I'm Dr. Brooke Myatt. I am the president/chair of the Women's Advocacy Group here at RCBC. I'm also the chair of the Entertainment Technologies Department, and I'm also the host of the Baroness Podcast. So our Women's Advocacy Group here has a podcast called The Baroness, and you can find it wherever you listen into your podcast. So please look up The Baroness. We are thrilled to have you with us today to explore the dynamics of a female president and the unique challenges and triumphs that come with such a role. First, I'd like to extend a heartfelt thanks to the RCBC Women's Advisory Group, the Political Science Department, the League of Women Voters, the Alice Paul Institute, and the American Association of Women, and to thank our panelists this afternoon. Your dedication and collaboration have made this event possible, and your commitment to empowering women in leadership is truly inspiring. As we engage in today's discussion, let us celebrate the remarkable achievements of women leaders and explore how we can continue to break barriers and pave the way for future generations. Together, we can foster an environment where every woman feels empowered to lead and succeed. So thank you again for being here. I would like to introduce now Professor Ken Mariano, Science Chair for the Political Science Club.
Okay, thank you for joining us. I see there's a lot of us here today. I think that this is a very important panel discussion because we are now at the cusp of history that we may potentially have the first female president in American history. We know that it got pretty close in 2016 with then it was Secretary Clinton, and then now we have Vice President Harris. So I want to welcome everybody, and before we do get started, I'd like to introduce our co-president of our Political Science Club, Xander Cash.
Hi, I'm the co-president of the Political Science Club here, and now that it is election year, many of us first-time voters here, at least college students that showed up, it's very important for us to talk about our options in voting and to make sure that we go into the voting booth educated on every candidate possible. And when something new pops up, like potential of having a first female president, it's important to talk to people who are in the political sphere around us and talk to other voters about how we can go forward with this. Thanks.
Thank you, Xander. And now I would like to introduce our moderator for the panel, Allison Millward. She's an assistant professor of history at RCBC. She holds an MA from State University of New York at Albany and a BA in government and international politics. With an academic background in war and society, her research interests include women experiences in war, life writings of participants in conflict, wartime art, and media and design history. And she is currently undertaking research on the lived experiences of nurses on the Western Front during World War I. Please welcome Professor Millward. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Myatt, Professor Mariano, and Xander. We're so excited to gather today to discuss previous leaders and moments of women in power in history. I'd like to begin by allowing our panelists to introduce themselves, and so I'll go ahead and begin with our first panelist, Olivia Arrico.
Hi, everyone. My name is Olivia Erico. I am the Public Programs Manager at the Alice Paul Center for Gender Justice, aka, or formerly known as the Alice Paul Institute. We recently did a rebrand, which is very exciting. My area of interest, my specialty is history. I have a background in public history, a master's from Rutgers University. And my area of interest is really women in grassroots organizing and feminist history.
Thank you so much, and I'll continue with Dr. Christine Agaibi.
Hi, I'm Christina Gaiby. I have master's and doctoral training in counseling psychology with a specialty area in resilience. I'm a instructor professor here at RCBC for the last few years. And my interest in the area of resilience is just learning how to navigate changes and challenges that may come with changes and navigating those successfully so that we can thrive to the best of our ability. I also have done some women's leadership myself. I was the president of the Ohio Women of Psychology a few years ago, and so kind of bring that lens into this as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Molly Gonzalez?
Hi, yeah. My name is Molly Gonzalez. I'm the advocacy manager at the Alice Paul Center for Gender Justice, formerly known as the Alice Paul Institute. I studied political science and gender studies in college and received a master's in human rights at American. So my focus is really seeing feminism as a tool for achieving human rights.
That's wonderful. Thank you to all three of you. And again, we have so much varied and excellent experiences here, so I'm really excited to get started. What I'll do is I have some questions here, and we could go down the line, or if there's no one in particular who'd like to start, anyone who would like to jump in can. After about 45 minutes or so of conversation, we'll go ahead and have an open question session with the crowd. So if anybody out there is thinking about or writing things down and would like to jump in, please do so. So we're going to start with our first question, and Professor Mariano really said it nicely with this idea of we are on the cusp, right? We are definitely on the cusp of groundbreaking history here. And so I would like to start with Vice President Harris and her campaign, and really what that means to history. So Vice President Harris has made history as the first woman of color nominated for the presidency by a major party. But she is not the first woman to run for president. Again, anyone who would like to jump in is free to do so, but maybe you all can tell us a little bit more about the history of women running for president in the United States. Anyone like to start off? Go ahead.
Yeah, so something people might be surprised to learn is that women have been running for the presidency longer than women had the right to vote. Right, so most women got the right to vote in 1920 when the 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution, but the first woman who ran for president ran in 1872. Her name was Victoria Woodhull. She was a suffragist, she was a feminist, she was actually one of the first female stockbrokers on Wall Street. So that was the first woman who ever ran, 1872. People didn't take her campaign very seriously because she had radical political beliefs, but also because she was under 35. And so you need to be 35 to run for president. So she was the first in 1872, and we really see a big increase in women running for president in the second half of the 20th century. So the first, and these women would run as Republicans, Democrat, and third party. Across the political spectrum, women have run for president. The first Republican woman to be nominated, to be put up for nomination, so she didn't receive the nomination, but she was put as a candidate. Her name was Margaret Chase Smith, and that was in 1964. Another really important figure is Shirley Chisholm. She ran for president in 1972. She was the first black woman to seek the Democratic nomination for president. And then, of course, we've already mentioned her, but Hillary Clinton in 2016 became the first woman to receive a major party nomination for president.
Thank you so much. Is there anybody else who would like to add to that? I have a bit of a follow-up. Oh, would you like to add? Go ahead.
I just think she did a great job.
You did a wonderful job. I have a bit of a follow-up to kind of tease out some of these ideas here. And I think you mentioned it really, really nicely as you began. But did these women expect to win the presidency? Or were they just sending a message about women in politics? Or was there a mix? Can you maybe explain that a little bit for us?
Yeah, I can start, and if anyone wants to add in. I think I'll go back to Victoria Woodhull. Like I said, she was the first woman. She ran under a party that she started called the Equal Rights Party. And so I think at this time, especially keeping in mind the fact that she was under 35, so she knew that, like, according to the Constitution, she could not actually run. Mm-hmm. It was a statement about women's equal rights. The Equal Rights Party had nominated Frederick Douglass as her vice president. He did not accept. I don't know the reasons, but it was a political statement about the equality of people. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Our next question is going to go a bit global because as we've seen in world history, there have been women heads of state. So I want us to kind of take a look at this from an international, perhaps transnational lens as well. The United States, as we all know, has never had a female president, but plenty of nations worldwide have had women heads of states. In your thoughts, were their leadership markedly different from their male counterparts? And if so, in what ways?
So I think we like to think that we're like the leaders of the free world in the United States, that we're the beacons of progress, that we do everything first and we're the best because we're the West. But the United States is one of 6 countries that has not yet ratified CEDAW, and CEDAW is basically a women's bill of rights that was proposed by the UN almost 50 years ago, right? It's saying it's the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination, and we sit as one of 6 countries that hasn't ratified it, next to Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia, countries that we don't think of as being leaders in women's rights. And we don't have codified gender equality, right? We don't have an Equal Rights Amendment, even though when the United States helps other nations write a constitution, we always recommend codify your gender equality. But that doesn't mean it's not an exciting time to talk about global women's leadership, right? Our neighbors in Mexico just elected their first female president, President Sheinbaum, Claudia Steinbaum. And she's a scientist who served as the head of the she was the environmental secretary of Mexico City before she was the president. And as a politician, she ran on a platform of free healthcare, free education, anti-gun, lifting people out of poverty through education and different state programs. And she won her presidency by a landslide. Notably, she's very far left, much more far left than her predecessor. And so as Mexico is celebrating their first female leader, however, 9,000 miles away in Bangladesh, the Bangladeshis are kicking out their female leader, their authoritarian female leader, who's cracked down on the opposition, cracked down on the free press, led to a student uprising that stormed her palace and kicked her out. Why am I talking about all of these random women? Well, does it matter if she's a woman? Like, is my question, right? Are women more peaceful? Are women better leaders? Women can be leaders. We've seen this. They're capable of it, as are men, but they can be both arbiters of peace. And if we think of, for example, the United Kingdom's longest serving Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, they can be arbiters of great, great violence, especially against other women. And so I think, thinking of Margaret Thatcher, who said, "The feminists hate me, don't they?" Well, I don't blame them. I hate the feminists. Feminism is poison. She was marketably anti-gay, anti-abortion, and anti-women's liberation. So are women more peaceful? Do women serve differently than men? I'm not sure. I think both of those kind of questions can and often do rely on sexist stereotypes. Maybe women are more peaceful, but that does rely on a gendered stereotype. And so I think if we want to kind of transcend notions of sexism and gendered stereotypes, that means transcending these stereotypes that claim women, just by being a woman, are better at certain things, are more accustomed to peace.
Well, and I think you make a really important point there, in that women are inherently more peaceful, and men are kind of flipping that stereotype as well. Men are incapable of peace, right? So we kind of lend these different gendered stereotypes to both sides, absolutely. But you've come up with excellent examples of ways in which we've had very proactive female leaders, but those who are, as you mentioned, are getting unseated as we speak. Any more thoughts on even just the perception of the United States having a female president, even if just not from comparing to other nations, but even just the concept that the United States, as you had mentioned poignantly, is kind of lagging behind in some of the equal rights policies that we've seen. But anyways, just some of the messages that's sent with the United States not having a female president. Would anyone like to speak to that, or even the previous question?
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest jobs of a president, right, is to signal to, is the world leader, is the ambassador to the world. They are the ones that choose all of the ambassadors. One of their only kind of unchecked and balanced position is being this global ambassador. And so maybe through having a female president, we can finally signal that we care about women in this country, because the past few decades of legislation does not really indicate that. And so more than just indicating that we care about women. It could indicate that we're catching up because we're really, really behind. Our neighbors in the north and south have already had women heads of state. Most of the EU has had women heads of state. We're far behind. And so as far as like how we can catch up to the rest of the world, which is a really dire human rights problem, then that's something that a woman president could signal.
Absolutely. Thank you. Any other thoughts?
I think it also could signal that we can be both strong and compassionate, wise leaders, and bring in all of the female lens into this potential. When Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand was head of state, that showed that there's some quotes about this, that she showed the world that neither age, nor gender, nor motherhood, nor any other barrier can stop you from reaching your full potential, because she became head of state at 37 years old. So you can balance both the compassion and the strength, I think, and still show a force of strength in the world, but with a compassionate lens as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for your thoughts on that. Now, we talked a little bit about women running for presidency. And so just to kind of think of the actual possibility of a woman being elected into the executive branch, I want us to lean into both, examples from the past, but even just the present and what that could potentially mean. When we think of all the feminist movements of the past, these what's often called the waves of feminism and the several feminist movements, was getting a woman elected to the executive branch necessarily a goal of the feminist movements, or to kind of swing back around to the first question, was it really just to kind of raise awareness? What might be some reasons why certain movements would push a female president?
Yeah, I can speak to this one.
Yeah.
So I think the first thing, to say the answer is both like a yes and no.
Mm-hmm.
I think the first thing that we need to draw out, which you hinted at, is that when we talk about feminism, it's not one thing. We're talking about a movement that has existed for over 100 years. The people who have been in this movement, incredibly diverse range of thought, political orientation, goals. So for some women, some feminists, yes, it's been a goal to get women in the presidency. For other women, it's not. For a long time, remember, women that we call first wave feminists were just fighting to get the right to vote. The idea that they could be president was like much, much in the future. For people we might call second wave feminists, and when I say that, I'm really talking about people in like the 1960s, 70s, 80s. There was a huge diversity of thought in that movement. There were women who were much more concerned with issues that were impacting ordinary women every day. So things like the gender wage gap, reproductive health, those kind of issues that we see in our day-to-day that impact everyday women. But there were other women who were very interested in this question of a woman president. And the historical moment when this started to change was 1980. So the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan was the first time since 1920, when women got the right to vote, that more women than men voted in the election. It was also notable because there was a notable gender gap. So what I mean by that is that they noticed that more women had voted against Ronald Reagan than men. So the voting pattern was really different if you looked at gender. So because of this outcome in 1980, it really got some feminists at the time, particularly women associated with the group, the National Organization for Women, interested in the idea of getting a woman on the ticket for the 1984 election. Because they thought, okay, more women are coming out to vote than men, and women don't always vote the same way as men. So if we get a woman on the Democratic ticket, maybe we can win this election. So those women, for the 1984 election, rallied behind the Democratic Party to get them to nominate a woman vice president. They put a lot of pressure on them, and eventually a woman was selected. Her name was Geraldine Ferrero. She was a representative from New York City. So they get her on the ticket. Unfortunately, for the women who were planning this, the Democrats were blown out in a landslide. One of the biggest defeats in US political history. So the lesson there of course, is that just because you get a woman on the ticket does not mean that women will vote for her. More women voted for Reagan in that election in 1984 than they voted for Mondale, who was the presidential nominee.
Awesome. Any other thoughts? I have a bit of a follow-up question to this because I think really this idea of messages, right? So we've kind of been smoothing out this concept of different messages that are being sent both globally and nationally. What might you suggest, at least from the historical record or just, idea, like philosophy on gender and public office? What might you suggest to people who say, oh, women only run for president as a result of feminist movements, right? Like there might be that lack of seriousness. They might just be trying to be president to make a point. Would we have any ideas on even not just a response from you, but maybe responses that you've heard or seen throughout history?
Yeah, I can start on this one. I think, so what I've read and heard about other people talking about Kamala's campaign versus Hillary's in 2016. And if you can remember back to 2016, if you want to remember back to 2016, Hillary really did emphasize this, like, I'm going to break the glass ceiling. I'm going to be the first woman president, sorry. But if we look at Kamala's campaign, she's not doing that as much, right? So I think she has picked up this messaging question that you've noticed, that it might not be a thing that sells for a lot of people, right? This glass ceiling, a woman in this role, it might actually work against her in some ways. At least that might be what the campaign is saying when they're not really pushing this point forward.
Any other thoughts?
It's really important, I think, to push the, not just to be, the first president, like you're saying, but to push the issues forward that are important. And there are issues related to equality. Of course, we've been leaders in many other areas through Congress or leaders in private sectors. And this is an important step for global equality, but also within the U.S. And so this is the next kind of logical step. It is important to have a woman president potentially, but it's also important that it's not just looked at as just a feminist issue, but for moving the entire movement along.
Awesome, thank you. Now, we've talked a lot about elections themselves, but I'm wondering what kind of lessons can we glean from campaigns of past women candidates? So we know some of the possible reasons or motivations why they ran. We know that there were some who were quite successful in their own ways, even if they didn't quite make it to office. They'd sent messages. But what are some core lessons just from these campaigns, even just how to run a campaign or, kind of like we were just talking about with the 2016 election, messages that work or don't work, just hindsight of the last 100, 120 years or so. Are there any key lessons we can take away?
Okay, well, I'll start with this one. And I'm going to go back to the campaign of Geraldine Ferrero that I was talking about before when she was vice president, because I think that gets to something that is really kind of important for any campaign, any election, right? They thought having a woman as the vice president would help get the women's vote for the Democratic Party. They saw that didn't work. And so I think the lesson there is that if you are a woman running for an office, you can't just depend on getting the women's vote because you are a woman. And as voters, I think what we also get from that is that we have to hold men and women candidates to the same standards. And by that, I mean, you have to be an informed voter. You have to do your research, know where all the candidates stand on the issues, regardless of their gender, and vote for the person who best represents you.
This is also a quick campaign, right? I think another huge difference a lot of people are putting forth about with 2016 is, of course, Hillary really leaned into being a woman and that would make her different than her, not enemy, but opponent. There, thank you so much. But she had a couple years to do that. She was cranking that out for a while. This is a short campaign. This was 100 days, if that. And so it didn't give us a lot of time to kind of question her and her motivations the same way it did with Hillary. She isn't under the same microscope that Hillary was under. We aren't getting the same kind of hit pieces that we were with Hillary. It's a completely different campaign for material reasons because it's a lot less time. And similarly to what Olivia is echoing, that women in all theaters are often boxed in. You're a woman, so you do this. You're a woman, so you vote for a woman. And we know from 2016, from 1980, from every time a woman has run for any office, that's not true. That women don't just vote for other women because they're women. Women are more complex than that, just as men are more complex than that. Men vote for women all the time. Women vote for men all the time. And so to echo Olivia's point that gender doesn't have to be this defining factor of someone, that was a feminist aim, is to break that mold that your gender defines every single thing about you, and your gender is a amalgamation of stereotypes that aren't necessarily positive. And so when we're looking at this very short campaign, compared to other presidents that we have voted for, or presidents that we haven't been able to vote for, but we watched on TV, for those who are voting for the first time, this is a different campaign for a lot of reasons, but one of them is because it's shorter.
Absolutely. Certainly historic in multiple ways, not just because of Vice President Harris's candidacy, but just everything that had transpired. Absolutely. Making this a shorter campaign for her. Any other thoughts? Excellent. So we know from the women's suffrage era, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask a question of individuals from the Alice Paul Institute. There were women, but there were groups of people in general who were anti-suffrage, again, including women. What kind of voices did we hear in the past from people who had said not only should women not vote, but they shouldn't hold leadership positions in public spaces like the presidency? And do we still kind of see traces and attitudes like that today? Any thoughts on that?
Okay, I'll start.
Yeah, yep.
Yeah, I can start on that. So I'm going to break this down and start with like the anti-suffrage question. Why were there women who were anti-suffrage? It seems counterintuitive. Why would you be against your own right to vote? And I think so there's a concept called the separate spheres when we talk about history. It's really that there was a domestic sphere and a public sphere. The domestic sphere is the home. That was where women belonged, raising children, cooking, cleaning, etc. The public sphere was the masculine realm. That was holding public office. That was engaging in politics. That was going out to work. And this was a dominant ideology in the 19th century. And we do see echoes of that still today, but we'll get to there. So there were anti-suffrage women because this was the ideology they were brought up in. They even as women believed, like, I am a woman. I am supposed to be in the home. My responsibility, my role in society is raising children, making sure they're good citizens. So I think that's an important part of that, is that these are beliefs that people were brought up in, same way that we're brought up in some gendered stereotypes still today. And I think getting to the second half of your question, we definitely do still see echoes of this idea that women belong in the domestic sphere and not the public sphere. I think it's a more fringe belief than it was in the 19th century, but we definitely still see it in some places.
Yeah, definitely that duality of spheres. We still kind of see lingering, absolutely. It had oftentimes kind of been seen as something of the past. The spheres have broken, and I like that idea that it may still be a fringe, but it definitely still exists in some realms. So tying into this, there and some of these concerns that individuals might have about the role of the executive branch in general, and some of the concerns that too much progressive change might be made, too many things might change too fast. I want us to kind of break down this idea of reality versus kind of maybe some fears or like ideals, okay? And so my question now is, what are actually some of the limitations of the executive branch in their ability to make progressive change?
Yeah, so we kind of have two, what seems like completely different worlds that are going to happen in November. That's kind of what they're telling us. And the framers and the founders made a lot of mistakes, but one thing that they were holding in their mind when they were framing our government was a fear of kings, the divine right of kings. They were scared of a monarch. They were scared of one guy controlling everything and ruining it. And so they put together tons of different, what they're called, checks and balances to make sure that a king would not emerge and ruin their new country. So Article 2 of the Constitution outlines what it is that the president can actually do. And the powers are a lot more limited than we might think. The president is not a king. They have to get checks and balances for a series of different behaviors, we'll say, from the Senate. They have all of their, what I was talking about earlier with how they get to confirm ambassadors and pick all of their different secretaries, the Secretary of Labor, the Secretary of the Environment, the Secretary of the Interior. Those all have to be confirmed by the Senate as well. So when we think about all of the powers that be of the scary, there's one that's maybe scary to some, that's scary to me. What's important to note is that the presidency, the executive branch itself, has immense limitations in that position is not a king. And that when we had a president in 2016 who was elected who did not maybe share some of our views on women's rights, on the equality of genders, what erupted was the greatest and most populated mobilization of women in the history of this country. And so the president is not the one who defines how each person in here thinks and believes. And in fact, we get to vote more than just on November 5th to decide what all of us believe and how that is impacted into legislation. And so, yeah, of course, the president is a very powerful person. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't be yelling at us on the phone and texting us every day, which I'm sure you guys are getting those texts too, if it wasn't such an important position. But luckily, the framers thought ahead a little bit to ensure that they would not become a god, a demagogue. And so what's also very important is that we can vote for our legislatures as well, and that their job, in part, is to check and balance this presidency.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that's very well said. Despite how it feels sometimes, there are other positions that are up for grabs in November too that are just as important. And if not, because of checks and balances, as important as the presidential election, definitely. Any other thoughts on the limitation of the executive branch and powers of the executive branch in general?
It's going to be up to creating diplomatic relationships on all sides because of those limitations, if they want to, make any progress moving ahead. So it's up to this president, whoever it's going to be, to reach a kind of diplomacy both globally and at home in order to get these things done because of these limitations, which are, again, put in for our protection.
Yeah, I'm just going to add one more historical example. So we are from the Alice Paul Center. We are named after Alice Paul, who was a suffragist. She helped get women the right to vote. One of the things that Alice did that added to the movement that was really one of her big contributions was that when President Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated, became president, he was against suffrage. He was very anti-suffrage. And she decided, okay, for the next election, what we're going to do is get all the women who could vote, because in some Western states at this time there were women who could vote, and we're going to tell them not to vote for Wilson. So if Molly just told us the president actually doesn't have that much power, and that would be something that falls into the legislature. Why did Alice put the pressure on women voters to vote out Wilson? Because one of the powers that the president does have, and this is what Alice believed, was to shape public opinion. So he could, if he went out in front of Congress and made a speech and said, I do support women's suffrage, that would really change public opinion and the opinion of people in his party in the legislature. So I just wanted to add that as kind of a counterpoint to Molly's point about the limitations of the executive.
Definitely fair. We were kind of breaking down ideal and reality, and absolutely, sometimes they kind of go back and forth and switch, for sure. Absolutely. I want us to kind of keep on this idea of change, though, because, again, I think we're really touching on this theme of, regardless of what happens in November, there's this idea of a historic election. There is this idea of change as well across all of the branches of government, across all of the different, areas of government, whether it's federal, whether it's local, whether it's state. And even though we know that some of these ideas of women leadership versus male leadership are based off of stereotypes, we talked about the dual sphere, and we talked about different perceptions of what gender is or what people thought it was in the past, women, I think, inherently have different experiences from males in society because of these stereotypes and because of what has been perpetuated. So that said, I think my next question is combining this idea of change, but this idea of, having different experiences, based on some of these social ideas. How can women kind of utilize both like these individual experiences they may have had, but like collective experiences as well to contribute to this changing landscape?
So resilience is my area of kind of expertise, and this area really involves a lot of flexibility and learning and adaptability to different changes and different challenges, and that has happened domestically, both at home and domestically within this country, and then also globally as well. So they can certainly contribute to some of these areas through the collaborations that they do, through, again, leading with strength and compassion at the same time, maybe even being calm under pressure. And again, these things are stereotypical, but can also be beneficial as we develop and grow and change as a country. To be more flexible, to adapt, and to learn from others, which is a strength definitely that women can have on many different arenas.
Excellent. Any other thoughts? A related question, and this is kind of like as we're winding down on our questions here. Again, going back to that idea of potential collective and shared experiences based off of everything that we've been talking about, are there strengths women bring to the table that can ease transition? Again, whether, no matter what happens in November, it's definitely a time of that's going to require some sort of diplomacy, peacekeeping transition. Are there things from our lived experiences that can help ease, these transitions while, having or encouraging people to look forward to the future, so citizens look forward to the future?
So again, looking at just research or even global women leadership, and some of these, again, are very stereotypical kind of adjectives or descriptions, but they really do bring some strengths to the table that can help move things forward a little bit, and more equality and more balance. But things like collaboration, able to collaborate with lots of different people. Again, like the New Zealand head of state, she was compassionate, but also had wisdom and strength. They can be calm under pressure, have attention to detail, being open and intuitive, having a strength of empathy and understanding what other people may bring to the table and understanding multiple different perspectives. Again, the flexibility and adaptability and the learning that comes with resilience, and able to move through challenges and navigate those. Being bold at the same time with having emotional intelligence and understanding what different groups may bring to the table, as well as being effective communicators. That can be really an important concept for everything domestically and globally as well. Having an inclusive vision that includes everybody else's ideals and perspectives is important. Being holistic in their decision-making and not just looking at things logistically, but also, again, with compassion and intuition and empathy. They can be visionary leaderships that are confident and productive. They can be both optimistic and positive. They can go after the things that they want to do with tackling fear at the same time, and having a caring perspective while, again, exhibiting strength and leadership. So there's many good qualities that can balance both strength and leadership, and also compassion and kindness that the world needs now more than ever.
I guess I would say I would hope that men could be compassionate and kind too, and that we could encourage not just women to be those that have to have that burden of compassion, empathy, and kindness, and that looking at examples of women leadership Jacinda Ardern is a great example. She was only in power for, I think, a year and a few months. If we look at women who were in power for decades, Angela Merkel is an example of someone who was, the leader of Europe, kind of Germany, for over 20 years, and her unempathetic economic policy decimated Greece. I mean, there's a lot of things that happened too, but that's part of it. And so a lot of her lack of empathy, as with other women leaders like Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh, like Margaret Thatcher in the UK, they did not demonstrate a whole lot of empathy towards other women, minoritized groups. All three of these women have put forth policies that are anti-gay. Angela Merkel less so as Margaret Thatcher and Sheikh Hasina. But to say that as far as women in leadership, women deserve to be leaders just as much as men deserve to be leaders because they're human beings, not because they have something about their gender that makes them better at certain things than other genders. All of us have kindness within us. All of us have empathy within us, not because I was born with a certain gender, but because I'm a human being. And because we have history and examples put forth of both women in leadership and men in leadership making terrible mistakes and not being empathetic. And of course, we have examples of women and men in leadership making great choices and liberating a lot of people too. And so I think my kind of thesis that I'll conclude with that question is that just because someone is a woman does not mean that they are predisposed to be more peaceful, that they're more predisposed to oppose war, that they're going to make policies that will help women, that their experiences are very important, and I would hope that they would guide the decision-making. But as I've mentioned with some of these examples of women in leadership, they didn't necessarily stand for bodily autonomy or the liberation of queer people or strong trade unions to make sure that women had limited work days, for example. And so gender stereotypes, I don't think will liberate us. I don't think will push us forward into a new feminist epoch. I think understanding that all of us are capable of empathy, compassion, peace, using our personal experiences to care about others is what would put us forth into a new feminist epoch. And if that includes a woman president, that's great. But I don't think if that woman president doesn't come with an advocacy for other women, then that's kind of a bummer, I think.
Any other thoughts on women in transitions, whether historically, thinking about that idea of historical examples or even just from a modern lens? I'll ask this kind of as I wrap up my set of questions here. I always like to think of, just children, whether it was individuals I grew up with or I watched grow up, who always said, I'm going to be president someday, or I want to be president someday. And from my experience, it's been both males and females say that females tended to get a little bit more pushed to the side than males. But what I'm going to ask is this. What would you say to this generation of young people, whether they're elementary aged or, college age and they're poli-sci majors, regardless of gender, who say, I want to be president someday? What would your message to them be? Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think one of the messages or themes that has really emerged from this conversation is qualities that we'd like in a leader, right? We've talked a lot about empathy, kindness, being able to relate to other people and communicate well, all these qualities that you kind of outlined in a great leader. And I think the thing I would say is I hope that you can do these things, that you will be an empathetic leader, that you can communicate well. And that also, since we have been talking a lot about women and women's issues, that regardless of who you are, how you identify, that you will take seriously the issues women and other gender minorities in this country face and make them a real part of of the work you would do.
I know it's a bit of a lightning round question.
I would say it's a big responsibility, but it's an important platform that you have, that you can voice things to move society forward. And again, to lead with compassion and empathy is just as important as leading with strength. regardless of the gender of the person that is running or in that office. It is important to have a lot of wisdom and compassion at the same time. And so it's an important role to model to the world, how you want things to see in the world for the next generation and many generations after that.
To someone who wants to be president,
Yeah.
good luck. Make sure you read a little bit more than some of the guys we've got around here.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I will go ahead and conclude today's event. Thank you again for your enthusiasm and expertise. It is very much appreciated. And thank you to everybody who came out today to listen to this panel and these excellent thoughts on both the past, present, and future of politics.